Hey, what's going on, CIA Con? My name is Ted Harrington, and it is my honor to be your keynote speaker here at CIA Con. I'm the author of a book called Hackable, How to Do Application Security Right. And what I'm here to do today is to share with you some of the insights from this book, specifically to help you understand how to build better, more secure software by being able to find the security vulnerabilities that matter. So I'm going to walk you through how to do that, and hopefully you'll walk away with a strong understanding of how to actually implement some of these ideas. So with that, let's get going. The first question that we have to ask ourselves here before we can really go any further is to really understand what security testing even is anyway. Now, that sounds pretty straightforward, right? What is security testing? But you'd be surprised how often organizations simply don't understand what it is that we're talking about, don't understand what security testing actually is. So when we think about these ideas, it's important to note that what you commonly might be expecting or might be asking for is really typically different depending on how different people understand what different terms mean. And that's really the heart of this, right? That there's this idea of term confusion. People very commonly use the wrong terms to describe things. And when you do that, that could potentially lead to a misalignment of the outcome that you might get as a result. So here's the way to think about this. Most people think about security testing, which security assessment is sort of the umbrella term for all security testing. And when people think about security testing, the most common type of security assessment, the term that people are commonly using, is this term penetration testing. But what's really interesting about that is that that's not usually what's being sold. What's usually actually sold is something else. It's vulnerability scanning. But what's actually needed is a third thing altogether, which is called vulnerability assessments. Now, here's what's crazy about these terms, right? They mean different things. They deliver different outcomes. They require different levels of investment, of time and effort and money. They're really remarkably different things, yet the terms are commonly substituted for each other inappropriately. So let me use some metaphors to try to explain what these different things are. So penetration testing, this is what most people ask for or think that they're getting when they're talking about security testing. That's kind of like when the automotive car maker, right? When the companies who make vehicles, when they want to understand how a vehicle performs in a certain scenario. For example, they want to see how will the car perform in a frontal collision. They'll literally crash the car into a wall to see what would happen. That's kind of what penetration testing is like. It's where you take a scenario that you're interested in understanding and you actually run a simulated attack scenario, and you're essentially looking for a binary outcome in terms of could you or could you not achieve whatever the result was. So for example, could an attacker escalate privileges from basic user privileges to admin? That's essentially what a penetration test does. And the irony of it, though, is that they're really only suitable for very mature systems that have been through a lot of security testing already. And yet, that's commonly not actually what people are meaning when they're talking about them or pursuing them. But so that's what penetration testing is kind of like. It's kind of like the crash test for a car. But what's usually sold is vulnerability scanning. Now, if right now you were to go to your trusty friend Google and you were to do a search query for the term penetration testing, almost everything that you get back, not all of it, but almost all of it, would actually be for vulnerability scanning instead. Vulnerability scanning is when you take a tool that essentially runs automation in order to look for common known types of issues. It's very quick, it's very easy, it's typically very inexpensive, but it's really not the same thing as penetration testing. And so if we go back to cars and we use a metaphor here, the car metaphor is that really what we're talking about is like when the check engine light comes on in your car and you go to the mechanic to understand what the issue is, and they click that diagnostic tool, they stick it in, and it spits back some codes that say, hey, it might be this issue or whatever. That's kind of what vulnerability scanning is like. It helps you quickly identify some potential issues, but it's really not this comprehensive approach to vehicular safety. Now, let's look at these two side by side, right? Penetration testing, this is like a crash test of a car, and then the other thing, vulnerability scanning, is like running that diagnostic tool to see why the check engine light came on. Those are two really different things, and yet they're commonly interchanged for each other. Now, if that wasn't frustrating enough, there's yet another thing, and that's vulnerability assessments. And this is what people actually typically want when they're looking for security testing. And what vulnerability assessments are is there are a more comprehensive, holistic view of the system itself. You're looking to understand the majority of vulnerabilities that exist across the system, or at least within the scope of what you're looking at. And you're looking to understand the severity of the vulnerabilities that are discovered. You're looking for ways to be able to fix those issues, because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to improve the system overall. That's what most people are really looking for when they're doing security testing. And going back to our car metaphor, this is like, instead of a single crash test of a car, or instead of a single diagnostic scan, this is like the entire automotive safety engineering department. They think holistically about how all the different safety systems work together, from the side impact beams to the safety belts to the airbags. And that's really what vulnerability assessments are like. It's thinking holistically about your system and how all these different mechanisms work together, helping you really understand what you need to do in order to level up the security of the system. And that's what's really problematic about these different terms, is that you ask for penetration testing, you're sold vulnerability scanning, but what you really need are vulnerability assessments in most cases. Now, there are cases where you need a penetration test or you need vulnerability scanning, but what most people are looking for when they are talking about trying to perform security testing, they want that holistic, comprehensive view. So that's the important thing to keep in mind here. Now, do I want you to go memorize terms? Although I want people to use the correct term to describe the correct thing, that's actually not the point. The point here is to talk about outcomes. That's really what matters. So the way to think about this is start with your goal. What is your goal? If your goal is to determine how a mature system would perform in an attack, and that system has already gone through extensive security testing already and is very mature and very well hardened, that's a time when you'd want to use penetration testing. If, however, your goal is that you just want a quick check on common issues, your available time and budget is very, very limited, vulnerability scanning makes sense in that case. But if you want to find vulnerabilities, including especially custom exploits and sort of the unknown unknowns, if you want to assign severity ratings that make sense to your business and you want to understand how to fix those issues, that's when you want vulnerability assessments. So let's talk about now how you would actually go about actually finding issues within the context of a vulnerability assessment. So in my book, I mentioned I wrote this book called Hackable: How to Do Application Security Right, and in it, I outlined a method. And this method, essentially, if you can, imagine your triangle, right? And the triangle has different levels or different layers to it that sort of build towards this idea of security excellence. What's important to note is that what most organizations actually need is you really need the whole formula, the whole method itself. But when penetration testing is really just a vulnerability scan, you actually only get a few of the more basic, easier elements. And that is problematic for a lot of organizations. So let's dive in and talk about each of these different steps and what actually needs to happen in order to find vulnerabilities that matter so that you can build better, more secure software solutions. There is a method to the madness. Now, the first step is analyze design. Now, the idea here with analyze the design is that whether you are the security tester yourself or you work for a company who's hiring security testers, the idea is that the tester really needs to understand the design of the system, needs to understand why it exists, what business problem it solves, need to understand the workflows and user provisioning and all of the different ways that the system is accessed. And this is really important because it's going to matter in the later stages in terms of how do you actually go about finding some of the higher order issues. You need to understand how the system works. Now, what's problematic here is that many security approaches actually don't care about the design of the system. And that should be a red flag. If you don't care about how the system works, if you don't care about the use case for the system, right, that's going to be an issue. Because let's say, for example, you're talking about a software system that works for the creation of movies. That is going to have a different risk profile, a different threat model than the same app even, or a similar app that is used in, say, financial services. And this is where analyzing design really matters. So it's important that you understand how the system works because it dictates what you'll do in order to find some of the higher order issues later. Now, the next sort of stratosphere of issues are running automated scanners and looking for known vulnerabilities. And these are two different things, but I mentioned them together because they overlap a bit. So running a scanner is what we just talked about before with vulnerability scanning. You want to do this because this is one of the first things that your attacker is going to do as well. So you want to see what they're going to see, right? That's really beneficial and helpful for you to identify those quick, easy to identify problems and flaws so you can fix them. It's quick. It identifies or it enables you to look at a broad range of things that would be maybe tedious to do manually. And then many of those things that you're actually looking for are known vulnerabilities. And by definition, that's what scanners actually do, is they are programmed to look for issues that are known to exist. So those are those three ideas: analyzing design, running automated scanners, and looking for known vulnerabilities. Those are the fundamentals. Those are basically the basics of security testing. Now, here's the problem. This is where most security testing stops. Most security testing today pulls up stakes at this point. And actually, a lot of security testing doesn't even account for all of these because, like I was mentioning before, many methods, it doesn't even matter what the design of the system is like or the use of the system. This is a problem because this is just the beginning, what we've talked about, these three ideas. But what really matters is what comes next. Now, before we can go any further, though, before you can get to the more advanced tactics, before you can get to where the important issues are found, there's this idea that I've come to refer to as the capability gap. Everything that's below the capability gap, you can do largely with tools or medium to maybe low levels of skill or experience. But everything that comes higher than that requires a high level of skill, high level of experience, and there's really not much tool or automation that you can do for it. I mean, there are tools that you use in the process, no doubt about that, but you can't extract the human from what comes next. And that's really important, that there is this sort of hard divide. I mean, imagine the Grand Canyon, right? There's this massive gap between one rim of the Grand Canyon and the other rim of the Grand Canyon, and in between, you can't exactly walk across that very easily. That's sort of what the capability gap is like. There's this huge divide between the basics that we just talked about and the advanced tactics that we're going to talk about next. So let's get into those advanced tactics. Now, the first advanced tactic is what's known as abuse functionality. And abuse functionality is this idea that you can actually attack the system by using the way the system works. And you can use that functionality in the attack itself. Now, I like to think of this one even as the sort of prototypical definition of hacking, right? Hacking ultimately is repurposing functionality for unintended consequences. It's being creative and solving problems in different ways, and it's sort of finding the unexpected. That's really what hacking is, whether you're talking about the bad kind of hacking or the good kind of hacking. And abuse functionality is really at the epicenter of that. So let me tell you a story to sort of frame what the idea is. There's a guy I know who told me this story about his high school's vending machine. And when he was in high school, he was like most high school kids. He wanted a lot of snacks and treats that would come out of a vending machine. But he also didn't have a lot of money to spend on those snacks or those treats. And so he sort of set out this problem statement for himself. And he said, well, how can I take this single dollar and use it to get many treats? So here's what he did. He attached a piece of dental floss to that dollar bill. What he was able to do was insert the dollar bill into the bill receptor. The bill receptor did its job, which ingested the bill, verified the denomination, and then said, you can pick your treat. That's what the bill ingester is supposed to do. There's no mechanism to prevent the bill from being pulled back out. So when the bill would go in with the dental floss, it would register the denomination, say you can have your treat, he'd pick his treat, and then with the dental floss, he'd pull the bill right back out. That's what abusing functionality is like. That is absolutely not the way that system is supposed to work. I don't need to call a single manufacturer of vending machines, and I will tell you with certainty they did not mean it to work that way. These are the kinds of things that exist in systems all the time. We can now talk about this idea of abusing functionality in a more of a technical exploit scenario. And we could talk about the work that's done by a hacker who goes by the pseudonym of Manfred. And Manfred was a hacker of online games. And specifically what he would do is he'd look at the way that online games have in-game currency. Now, if you're not familiar with these types of gaming systems, essentially the idea is you accumulate or earn or buy currency in the game. So it's like coins or diamonds or whatever. And then you spend that currency on in-game experiences, maybe new weapons or new levels or whatever. And they have these banking systems that facilitate that transaction. And I'm way oversimplifying things here, but essentially the way that it works is you have your account balance, you subtract the withdrawal amount, and you're left with your revised or your new balance. So let's say, for example, you have 500 coins and you're going to take out 100 coins. That leaves you with 400 coins. What Manfred abused was the way this system treated numbers. And specifically, he noticed that it was treating the withdrawal sum as a positive integer. And he asked this what-if question, which was, well, what if I used a negative integer? Sure enough, he found a way that he could manipulate the system so that it would say 500 coins minus negative 100 coins. And as we all learned in middle school, when you subtract a negative, it's actually addition. So he would be able to get whatever the upgrade or weapon or whatever it was that he was buying, and he would grow his accumulated balance. That's the kind of stuff that exists in software systems all the time. Maybe not necessarily this specific attack example, but these kinds of issues where attackers can abuse the functionality. And this is really, really important to note. Here's the key detail. There's not really a tool that can help you automate your search for this. You really need to have experienced, capable people who are experts in this type of stuff to be able to find these types of issues. The next idea of these advanced tactics is this idea of chaining exploits. Now, chaining exploits is combining multiple issues together to magnify impact. When I was a kid growing up, there was another kid in my neighborhood who had a trampoline in his backyard. And we were jumping on it. We were there all the time, right? What little kid doesn't love jumping on a trampoline? And I vividly remember this day when we first uncovered the idea of the double jump. Now, the double jump is essentially the idea that if we time the landing so that as I am starting to launch my jump, if we time it right when my friend is landing his jump, so his downward velocity actually amplifies my upward velocity, and it launches me, basically scared to death heights. And I remember that day getting shot so high that I wound up hitting these tree branches that were hanging over the trampoline. And I experienced this moment of weightlessness. And then I came, speeding, crashing back down to earth. And it was terrifying. And I thought I was going to die on the way down. And, obviously I didn't. I'm here with you today. But that was a moment when this idea of combining things became really vivid for me. I really realized that two things can be more impactful combined than either of them alone. And that's really what chaining exploits is like. So let me apply that to a technical exploit. Now, we had recently finished a security assessment for one of our customers of their application, and what we had discovered in part of this process was that first we discovered an information leakage issue. And this basically meant that any user of the system could identify all other users of the system. Now, on its own, that's not a terrible problem. You certainly don't want it. We certainly flag that as an issue that they should remediate. But on its own, it's not even really something that's exploitable, but nevertheless worth noting. And there was a second issue that we discovered as well, where the authorization was broken. And the authorization model to change credentials, if you want to change your password, the only thing that you needed to supply was the user identifier. Now, you only have your own user identifier in theory, so that shouldn't be an issue. But when you combine these two issues, we're talking about complete system compromise. I mean, the catastrophic outcome, this is what the attacker wants and what anyone who builds anything is dreading. Neither of those issues on their own could have resulted in a widespread compromise, but when you combine them, when you chain those exploits, that leads to a system-wide compromise. Again, this is the kind of stuff that you just can't find with a tool. You need to have that more malicious perspective in order to find these types of things, and it requires effort, and it requires time. And unfortunately, it also requires expense. But in order to find the vulnerabilities that matter, in order to build more secure solutions, this is the kind of stuff that has to happen. And then finally, we have the unknown unknowns. Unknown unknowns are the pinnacle of security testing. They are really what is the top of the pyramid, right? And unknown unknowns are this idea, just what it sounds like, the things you don't know about that are, vulnerabilities in the system that could be exploited. The idea of unknown unknowns really comes out of American psychology. It actually is where it first came from, and there's essentially three modes. There's known knowns. That's the issues that you know about and you can fix, and that's essentially the things you find in your security assessments, the outcomes. You can now fix things. And then you've, of course, got known unknowns, and those are things that are issues that are known to exist, but not necessarily known to exist in your system yet. And then unknown unknowns are you don't even know about them. And there's essentially three modes of unknown unknowns. The first mode is novel versions of common vulnerabilities. So you might be familiar with things like, for example, the OWASP Top 10. And the OWASP Top 10 is essentially a listing that's updated periodically of the most common vulnerabilities that impact web applications. And what novel versions of common vulnerabilities are, this is the idea where this class of issue might exist, but the way that it manifests in this particular type of software system maybe has never been seen before. And so that's a type of unknown unknown. And then there's 0 days in the supply chain. If you're not familiar with this term, 0 days are your exploitable vulnerabilities that are exploitable in the wild right now, where the defender has literally 0 days to patch or to remediate them. And the supply chain is the collection of integrations and platforms that any system is built upon, whether that's third-party, whether that's authentication of the third-party authentication provider or cloud platform or whatever it is that you're integrating with. Issues in those systems that might be exploitable could mean that your system is exploitable. Now, most companies are not going to invest time and effort in performing security assessments of other companies. And the way that you deal with that is through something called defense in depth. We won't go into that. That's its own keynote address. We won't go into that at this point. But what we will talk about are previously unknown attack methods. And these are things that have been viable, that an attacker could do, but the defender didn't know about. And my favorite one of these that we can talk about is the idea of request smuggling. Now, request smuggling, what this is, besides being just an amazing term, like whoever named this I love this person. Request smuggling impacts web applications. Now, web applications they receive a lot of traffic. And there's a few ways that you can deal with that. One way is you can build one server that is capable of handling all the traffic, but that is typically very expensive. Another way is you can have a series of lesser expensive web servers, and then the traffic can alternate between them. And that's what most businesses choose to do. But in order to do that, you need what's called a load balancer to actually distribute the traffic between the different web servers. Think of that like the traffic cop who's pointing, some cars in the right lane and then some cars in the left lane. Now, the software on both of these systems should handle requests the same way. But ultimately, they are independent implementations. And if there's a mismatch about how the different pieces of software, the web server software and the load balancer software, if there's a mismatch, that's something that an attacker might be able to exploit. And what they would do is they could actually sneak in a malicious request right alongside a legitimate request, and it would be served up as if the legitimate request were the only request, but ultimately there would be a malicious request snuck in. And there's endless things that an attacker could do with this, from changing credentials to leaking information to escalating privileges. There's all kinds of things that you can do. And so this is a pretty big problem. And what's crazy about this is that it was something like 14 or 16 years from the moment that this attack technique was possible until it was first noticed, or first documented, I should say. And then it's been at least 15 years since that point up to today. And people still don't really know what this problem is. And that's a really crazy problem when you think about it, that here's an issue that was exploitable for so long and continues to be exploitable in certain types of systems, and people don't even know about it. This is your classic example of something you can't automate. There's no tool for this. You need the experience, the expertise. You need to have that sort of malicious viewpoint, and you can't settle just for a tool-based approach. So to recap, we start with analyze, design, run scanner, look for known vulnerabilities. Those are the basics of the process. We got to make sure that we get past the capability gap, get to the other side. That's where we then abuse functionality, chain exploits, and seek the unknown unknowns. And you really want to do all of it. That's the important part here, is that if you are striving to build secure solutions, you really need to do it all. Yet, most security today falls woefully short of delivering that. When your penetration test, quote unquote, is really just vulnerability scanning, you only get some of the easier elements of this. So that is what I hope that you can walk away with today, both knowing how to find these issues and being aware of these common misconceptions that you should be aware of so that you can make sure they don't impact you. Everything that we talked about today comes from my book called Hackable: How to Do Application Security Right. You can sign up to get your copy right at hackablebook.com. It comes out in just a couple days, December 8th. So on Tuesday, this book will be out. So I cover in depth all of these ideas and more that take you from the beginning all the way through to being able to prove that you have a secure solution, all right here in the book. And with that, I pass the baton to you. Ideas are only as good as the action you take on them. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go talk about these ideas back at your company. So go find whoever it is, whether it's your peers, your boss, the board, the CEO, whoever it is that in your organization is most directly responsible for making sure that you find and fix your security vulnerabilities, go talk to that person and start sharing these ideas with them. Find out, what are you actually doing, irrespective of what term that you're calling it. And if you do those things, if you can really understand what the problems are and how to fix them, you will, and I mean you will, be able to build better, more secure software solutions. If there's any way that I can help you, use me as a resource. My contact information is on my slides. I wish you the best of luck. Thank you so much for having me.